Good afternoon, EDH enthusiasts. I'm the Planeswalker Project, and welcome to another Commander Deck Tech. One of the most helpful lessons I learned in improving my Commander deck building skills this past year was that not every deck needs to have the generic good staple cards. Cards like Creator Hope Behemoth are powerful and they're popular and maybe rightfully so, but they're kind of boring. I found that by looking to other cards to fulfill the same role, I was much more inspired to build more unique decks that were more fun and enjoyable. The commander of our deck today is Bess, Soul Nourisher, a 1/1 for 1, a green and a white. She has 2 abilities. Whenever one or more other creatures with base power and toughness of 1/1 enters under your control, you put a +1/+1 counter onto Bess. Whenever Bess attacks, each other creature you control with base power and toughness 1/1 gets +X until the end of turn, where X is the number of +1/+1 counters on Bess. This is a deck that focuses on 1/1 creatures. See, getting back to the Greater Hoof Behemoth roasting from earlier, I find that cards like that to be a little uninspiring when I put them into decks. I know that they're powerful and they're consistently good cards, but they can be rather bland and unfun when they hit the battlefield. Bess has an ability that, in a lot of contexts, can emulate what the Greater Hoof Behemoth does, in making our board state large for an alpha strike. She also lives in the command zone, and so having access to that kind of ability there is a lot different. I think she offers a much more inspiring approach to the game plan, in that she sits on the battlefield and gradually builds up +1/+1 counters as we play our 1/1 creatures. Our deck focusing heavily on those 1/1 creatures also gives us a very non-threatening vibe, as opposed to us dropping large creatures that demand more urgent responses. When the timing is right, you swing out with your field of 1/1 creatures, and because of Bess's attack trigger, among other cards, they become huge and can win us the game quickly. An important thing to note about Bess and a few other creatures in this deck is that they're only looking at the base power and toughness of the creature. If the creature's base power is 1/1, their current power and toughness is irrelevant to them getting the boosts. As such, some cards in this deck are geared towards making our 1/1 creatures even larger, before Bess even goes off. We have a wide variety of abilities in the deck that really make the best use of some value 1/1 creatures. We're running 33 creatures aside from Bess, and 31 of them are 1/1s. Let's begin with the cards that will create us 1/1 creatures. Farmer Cotton is X, a green and a white for a 1/1. When he enters, you create X 1/1 white halfling tokens and X food tokens. The food tokens are rather unimportant here, but the value that we want out of Farmer Cotton are those 1/1 creatures. We would only get 2 triggers off of Bess here, one from Farmer Cotton hitting play, and the other from the massive halfling tokens. But that's still 2 +1/+1 counters on Bess that will come in handy later on. Reese the Redeemed was one of my earliest commander decks, and so I have a soft spot for him in my decks. He's still an absolute beast. For 3 mana, we create a 1/1 elf. For 6 mana, for each of our tokens, we create a token that's a copy of that token, basically doubling our tokens. I chose not to run normal token doublers like Doubling Season and Parallel Lives in this deck, opting instead to rely on Reese for any token doubling abilities, as he is a 1/1 for 1 that can do the same thing. Skewed Swarm is a brutal token generator, giving us a 1/1 insect token upon a landfall trigger until we hit 6 lands. Once we get to 6 lands, we then instead create a token that's a copy of Skewed Swarm, who is also a 1/1. At that point, any landfall triggers beyond the 6th land gets us exponentially more Skewed Swarm tokens. Twilight Drover is a 1/1 for 3 mana. Whenever a creature token leaves the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter onto the Twilight Drover. For 3 mana and removing a +1/+1 counter from the Twilight Drover, you can create 2 1/1 white spirit creature tokens with flying. This is a very innocuous means to generate tokens, and it does synergize very nicely with the rest of our deck. Nomad's Assembly, Storm Herd, and Visions of Glory all have the potential to give us a large army of tokens, which all are 1/1 creatures. And while each of these will only ever give 1 trigger off of Bess each, these can help us transition to our endgame given the sheer numbers they can generate. Rabble Rousing is a 5-drop enchantment that has Hideaway 5. Whenever we attack with 1 or more creatures, we create that many 1/1 green and white citizen tokens. Then, if we control 10 or more creatures, we can play the exiled card with the Hideaway clause without paying its mana cost. The most powerful aspect of this card is that it makes that many tokens. So if you're already swinging in with a lot of creatures, you're going to create a lot of tokens. Scepter of Celebration goes along basically the same lines, creating a number of tokens equal to the combat damage the equipped creature deals. This is great to give whatever our largest creature is to maximize the number of tokens we'll create. One of the most overlooked and overpowered aspects of some cards in Commander is their design to create that many of something. Usually, creating one of something is enough value, but because this translates combat damage directly into an equal number of creature tokens, this means that as little as 5 damage will give us 5 more 1/1s, and in a deck like this, that can be very problematic. Speaking of large creatures, let's talk about some 1/1 creatures that we can rely on to get large either through their own means, generally through +1/+1 counters, or otherwise. Bishop of Binding is a removal piece on a creature that lets you exile an opponent's creature until the bishop leaves the battlefield. Whenever the Bishop of Binding attacks, target vampire gets +X/+X until the end of turn, where X is the power of the exiled card. Obviously, we'll be using this to exile whatever the largest creature is that our opponents control, and then when we attack with the bishop, we can give a vampire quite the buff. Now, we aren't on a whole lot of vampire creatures, but we can give the power boost to the Bishop of Binding itself. Crystalline Crawler is a mana dork and a mana rock all sort of bundled as one. We have a number of ways to put +1/+1 counters onto the Crawler, including tapping the Crawler itself, and we can use those counters to generate mana. Since it is a 1/1 creature, removing all of the +1/+1 counters on it will not kill it, as it can exist without any counters on it, meaning that we can then build it up again with more counters and continue getting value from it. Heronblade Elite and the Kami of Whispered Hope are our other on-theme 1/1 mana dorks. They can generate an amount of mana of any one color equal to their power. The Heronblade Elite can organically grow larger given the number of humans we can produce in this deck. The Kami also offers us a static ability that grants us an additional +1/+1 counter to a creature whenever we would put any number of +1/+1 counters on it. This, in a sense, functions as a tacked on Hardened Scales that can tap for mana, and it's this dual purpose design of this card that's why I run this over Hardened Scales. Mana Gorger Hydra is a classic Commander Haymaker, being a 1/1 with trample that grows larger with each spell cast. This is a great card to get out early game and let it sit and fester with more and more +1/+1 counters on it to then swing for tremendous amounts of trampling damage. Phytohydra is a fun card in this deck, converting any and all damage dealt to it to +1/+1 counters. Unlike other cards that have a similar ability, this replaces the damage altogether, rather than requiring the creature survive the damage to get the counters. By this method, the Phytohydra can swing in recklessly at opponents, or recklessly block oncoming creatures without the worry, because all of the damage will go towards making it larger. Rosy Cotton of the South Lane enters and creates a food token. Whenever you create a token, you put a +1/+1 counter onto another target creature that's not Rosy. This can be effective with a combo that we'll discuss later on, which can quickly turn infinite. Serra Ascendant is an oldie but a goodie, and is a 1/1 for 1 mana that has lifelink. As long as you have 30 or more life, the Serra Ascendant gets +5/+5 and has flying. In Commander, we begin games at 40 life, and so if you play this turn 1, you get a 6/6 flying and lifelink for 1 mana. That seems fair. It's also considered a 1/1 creature for the requirements of the cards in this deck, and so this is an absolute top tier card. Sigil Captain is one of the only 2 creatures in this deck that are not 1/1 creatures. This 3/3 has a powerful ability that gives us 2 +1/+1 counters to each creature that enters the battlefield that's base power and toughness 1/1. This is exactly what we want to do with this deck, and it allows our creatures to enter the battlefield as effectively 3/3s. Sovereign Okanekahau is the second card that's not a 1/1. This 3/4 has Ward 2, and whenever it attacks, for each creature you control with power greater than its base power, you put +1/+1 counters onto that creature equal to the difference. This makes the temporary buff from cards like Bess permanent, and because this stacks on top of any buffs the creature may already have, you can use this and make your creatures even larger than they already are. This snowballs very quickly and is perhaps the most dangerous card in the deck for opponents to let sit and play. K'thir's Crusade is here, and since we're all about putting +1/+1 counters onto creatures as our secondary strategy, this can help boost up our board to have unstoppable sized creatures. See, Bess will only ever get 1 +1/+1 counter on something like a Stormherd resolving. But with K'thir's Crusade, the Crusade sees each creature hitting the battlefield independently, and then it gives out those +1/+1 counters to all of your creatures. One facet of commander deck building I feel is overlooked at times is interaction and removal, and so let's discuss some of the important options you can consider for this deck. Dusk to Dawn is a board wipe that only hits creatures with power 3 or greater, which means we might be able to avoid that cutoff if our board state is still mostly 1/1 creatures. The second half, Dawn, lets us return all the creature cards in our graveyard with power 2 or less to our hand, which is literally all of our creatures except 2. Martial Coup is X and 2 white for a sorcery that creates X 1/1 white soldier tokens. If you pay 5 or more mana into X, it destroys all other creatures. This is a great way to utilize our mana production to clear the board while still leaving us with a good amount of creatures. The Battle of Bywater is a board wipe that only will hit larger creatures. If you've been lacking on getting the +1/+1 counters out, you can spare your creatures being impacted and clear opponents' boards at the same time. If you've got a good amount of creatures in play, this will give you a ton of food tokens, and this is especially helpful if you have Rosy Cotton in play. Vault 75 Middle School is the newest addition to the deck and is a 3-chapter saga. On Chapter 1, it exiles all creatures with power 4 or greater. Not destroy, exile. On Chapters 2 and 3, we put a +1/+1 counter onto each creature we control. This is great synergy, and we can clear out all the big creatures and then building up our own little itty bitty creatures. What's great about these board wipes is that many of our 1/1 creatures will be too small to be impacted. But if our board state has gotten too large and we want to use these board wipes, Inspiring Call is a great way to avert disaster, as it not only gives our creatures with +1/+1 counters on them indestructible, but we draw a card for each. Aura Mutation is our on-theme removal for enchantments, giving us a number of 1/1 saplings equal to the mana value of the enchantment we chose to remove. Now, how does this deck win? Perhaps the easiest way is to just turn creatures sideways, but we do have a few other routes to win the game, some of which require minimal effort. Starting off, we have Champion of Lambholt. It's a commander mainstay, and it's a 1/1 that gets a +1/+1 counter on it whenever a creature enters under our control. It also makes your opponent's creatures whose power is less than the champion's unable to block our creatures. If this grows large enough, our board state becomes entirely unblockable. Epic Struggle, tell me about it, is our alternate passive win con. If at the beginning of our upkeep we control 20 or more creatures, we win the game. Oftentimes this card hits the battlefield, and we have a board state that is large and in charge, and opponents will have one turn cycle to remove it or reduce our creature count to less than 20, but that's easier said than done. We do also run an infinite combo in this deck. While not entirely a win condition on its own, it does enable a great number of other cards in this deck to go online. Animation Module, and Ashnod's Altar. We only need one creature to have a +1/+1 counter put onto it, such as Bess, to start this off. The way that it works is we pay 1 mana to have the Animation Module create us a 1/1 servo. Bess will trigger and puts a +1/+1 counter onto herself. You can then sack the servo to the altar to create 2 colorless mana. One of those mana can then be spent to create another 1/1 servo, and then you get the +1/+1 counter again, and then you repeat this process as much as you want. Bess will become infinitely large. You can create an infinite amount of colorless mana. This also works in tandem with cards like Champion of Lambholt, Rosy Cotton, Twilight Drover, Wildwood Mentor, and the Cathar's Crusade. One of the only weaknesses of this deck is its reliance on the commander to get its board state large. She puts +1/+1 counters onto herself, and so if she's removed from the battlefield, those counters are normally lost. But since we're using the Ozolith in this deck, you can take all of the counters that were on her, or other creatures who leave the battlefield with counters, and you put them onto the Ozolith. Think of it as a bank where we can safekeep those counters, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, you could just move all of the counters from the Ozolith onto whatever target creature you like, such as a newly casted Bess, just in time for her attack trigger to make everything on your battlefield huge again. But for now, that will bring us to the end of this look at Bess Soul Nourisher. What do you think of this deck? Is this a build you'd like to try out? If you want to take a look at the full deck list, I'll include the link to the full deck in the description of this video. If you enjoyed this video, likes and shares are truly the best way to help support the channel. If you're new, consider subscribing so that you never miss another video. And as always, I appreciate all of you hanging out with me here today. I'll catch you all next time.